All right, welcome everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Hello, hello, hello. Happy Thursday. Thank you so much for joining us. Going to give everyone just a couple of minutes to get into the webinar. Welcome. So excited today. As you're coming in, feel free. I see everyone is already doing it. Drop your name in the chat. Tell us where you're from. Someone asked, will you receive a copy of the slides? Yes, you will. Happy Thursday. Give everybody about 1 more minute to get in. All right, let's see, we've got Texas. Nikki said, Nikki's in the house, okay. Iowa, Durham, North Carolina. Hello from Austin, Vegas, Chicago. Welcome, everyone. It's one of my favorite parts. I get to see everyone is zooming in from across the country. Louisiana, California. Michael is here. We've got consultants here, program leaders. Wonderful. All right, Nashville, Flint, Michigan, Portland, Robert with Uhuru. Hi, Virginia Beach. All right, everyone. So we are going to actually go ahead and get started. I'm so excited today. I think this is going to be a really engaging and useful webinar. Today, we are going to be talking about how can we mentor young adults with an approach that is sustainable, responsible, and empowering, specifically when they're going through crisis. Before we get started, I do want to go over just a few housekeeping things. Gonna go over just a little bit of housekeeping. So everyone is gonna be muted for best sound. Okay, if you have questions, feel free to just type them in the Q&A panel and we'll make sure to field your questions to the panelists. If you have comments, feel free to use the chat box. Live captions are available in the panel. Just click CC at the bottom of the screen. We've got a few polls. We always do our initial polls just to kind of feel out who's in the room. And then we have a poll later on in the webinar from our panelists. So just a few housekeeping. So let's actually, I see people are still coming in. All right, you can go ahead to the next slide. And so I think this question was asked earlier. You will receive access to the slides and the actual recording of the webinar. There will also be a link that's on the Collaborative Mentoring Webinar Series webpage, where you will have all the slides, the recording, and resources that are posted. And the panelists at the end there, we're going to provide their information. That way, if you want to further connect with them, you can. And of course, when you get those survey questions, please make sure that you respond to them. That way we can continue to collect some data and we can kind of know how we're doing and what you need. All right, so today's webinar is going to cover what is a crisis response framework. We'll have some interactive examples and then we'll wrap up, and hopefully you will leave with a shared understanding of a potential crisis and how you can address it as a mentoring program, and then a clear framework for how you'll be able to use this within your own organizations. All right, so before I introduce our speakers, I do want to see just who is in the room. We're going to launch a poll question just to see what experience level do you have with our topic, and then another poll question that describes your role. So what is your experience level in the mentoring field? You should see a question pop up on your screen. What is your experience level in the mentoring field? All right, looks like we've got about 70% that would consider themselves experienced, 7% experts, and 23% beginners. And then we just have one more question. What best describes your role as it relates to mentoring? So are you staff? Are you an affiliate staff? Are you a mentor, educator? Maybe you're a technical assistance provider, researcher, funder, or other. All right, looks like the majority are practitioners or program staff. Then it looks like we have a few that are part of the national or affiliate. We've got some mentors, educators. We've got a good mix here. Researchers, TA providers. Awesome. All right, well, I am so happy to introduce our speakers. We have Mobile Burrell. You may remember Mobile, I think it was from our June webinar. Mobile uses they, them pronouns, also known as MOBs, and Mobile is the Assistant Director of Technical Assistance and Institute Initiatives with Silverline Mentoring. We also have Sally Sanchez Pena, she, her, hers pronouns, and Sally is a program coordinator. And then we have Christina Haynes. Christina uses she, her, hers pronouns, and Christina is the Senior Director of Strategy and National Impact with Silverline Mentoring. So I'm going to hand it over to Mobile. Thank you.
Peace, everyone, and welcome. I feel like I'm talking to my family. I got cousins in the room. I see Nikki, Keisha, Pam, Sue, Jenny. I got folks from South Alabama joining us. Shout out to the Deep South. All right, welcome everyone, and thank you, Bianca, for getting us started. On the screen, you will find the Merriam-Webster definition of a crisis, as well as our working understanding for our organization of a crisis in order to frame us all together in the same place for today's conversation. For our purposes, a crisis can be considered any situation where there is acute concern about the well-being of a mentee, Oftentimes, the situation will be urgent or immediate, but crises can also develop or worsen over time. The situation may have the potential to cause harm to someone, whether it be the mentee or someone else involved. And before I do any more talking, I would love to hear from you all. So if folks would pop into the chat, what are some things that come to mind that either your organization has already dealt with or things that you may be worried about navigating when you hear us say crisis? So what are some of the crises that you all are navigating? Some of the examples that we have on the screen, and I'll let my colleagues cue us up to what you all are sharing. Our organization has navigated housing insecurity or homelessness. We've also supported mentors with working with their mentees around food insecurity, not only noting the need for having enough food, but also thinking about having culturally and dietarily appropriate food. Thinking about the incarceration of a mentee or a mentee's loved ones, intimate partner violence. And I see a lot of things coming into the chat. So I'd love it if my colleagues would share out some of the things that they're seeing come into the chat as well.
Thanks, Mobile. So a lot of things coming into the chat. I'm seeing community violence, lack of access to like electricity, personal hygiene needs, family trauma, sex trafficking, suicidality, mental health are also coming in, as well as the ones that you've mentioned.
Awesome. Thank you, Sally. Yeah, I hear you, Chad. Housing is always a big deal. So real. Thank you. So we all have a general sense of what we mean when we say crises, especially when we're navigating them in our organization. We also recognize that there are times when a mentee's experiences may feel like a crisis to a mentor due to the emotional responses that these may trigger, or those experiences may trigger for a mentor. However, it is worth noting the difference between a crisis, like the examples that we've all been discussing so far, and what may be a challenging situation for a mentee, in which a mentor may have difficult or significant anxiety about it, or it might challenge their ability to cope with that or provide adequate support to a young person, but wanting to note the difference between a crisis where it's really that time critical thing that's happening most likely versus something that can just be a bit challenging for a mentor to experience. Some examples when we talk about that more challenging situation may be navigating extreme poverty, which may be familiar to the young person, but may feel like a crisis to a mentor because it might be new to them. And so I'll note that the value of MAC support is something I cannot emphasize enough when we're thinking about being able to navigate crises. But before we go down that road of what can be helpful, I'll pass it to my colleague, Christina, to talk more about crisis response framework.
Thanks so much, Mobile. When we think about an organization's crisis response, the mission of your organization should drive. Are you a crisis response organization, or are you a mentoring organization? Do what you do well, especially if you are a mentoring organization. That's what you're going to be wanting to do well. No matter how broad your mission or how many services your program provides, you still have boundaries and you still have limits to what services and crisis response you can provide. An overarching question to guide how your organization forms program policies to respond to crises are the following. Think about these questions. Would it be sustainable for your organization to respond to all of your young people in this way that you're about to do in response to this crisis? Is your organization the best suited in your community to be providing this service? Most mentoring organizations can't be expert in everything from housing to food resources to trauma therapy to financial literacy. In that case, the goal for your organization is to connect the young person and their mentor to a service provider with more expertise or resources in that area. I want to make a note for mentoring programs that are located within broader agencies that do provide crisis services. Mainly, you're going to want to ensure that you have accurate information and familiarity with the other parts of your organization. You don't want to assume. So you want to ask, how many referrals are the other services? How many can they accept? What are the length of services? For example, if your program provides beds in a shelter, how many beds are available and what are the requirements for accessing them? so that you have accurate information on hand about all parts of your organization. Why is this important to have a framework? Because boundaries make us feel safe. Organizations that create boundaries and hold them allow participants, mentors, mentees, and caregivers a sense of safety through clarity, reliability, and predictability. When you have ambiguity and instability, it can make us feel unsure, anxious, or even scared. Further, when someone is in a crisis, calling the appropriate resource or connecting them to the appropriate resource is an act of caring. If a mentor were to call a program staff member during non-business hours and end up waiting for a call back for hours on end rather than reaching out to the appropriate provider, the delay could make the situation worse. So that's not as much of an act of caring. And above all, as mentoring organizations, we never want to undervalue the role of emotional support and bearing witness during times of crisis. While it can feel challenging when mentors and programs staff, when you're not able to prevent or protect a young person from an adverse event, mentors play an important emotional support role by empathizing with the young person, validating their experience and emotions, both in the moment and what is often a long follow-up time of processing emotionally. When it comes time to create a crisis plan, ideally you're doing so before your first match, but we'll talk about if you're doing so later. And here you're going to want to focus on your program policies and procedures, as well as relationships and resources in the broader community to support those. And lastly, the training of your staff and mentors. Having a plan for how your mentoring organization will respond to crises requires a three-pronged approach. I'm going to go through each. First, create a crisis plan before your first match by developing program policies and practices using the Elements of Effective Practice for Mentoring as your guide. Determine your organizational and program policies that align with your primary purpose and mission, which for many mentoring programs, that primary purpose is the relationship. You're going to communicate these policies to both the mentor and the mentee at the start of the relationship, or even before that, during your mentor recruitment, in the training process, and certainly during the match initiation meeting. And you're going to want to have reminders at appropriate times as the relationship and the life stage of the mentee develops. I'll give you an example. At Silver Lining Mentoring, staff are available during business hours, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. If a mentor or mentee is experiencing a crisis outside those hours, the program has already provided information on emergency resources to the mentor. Mentors and mentees can leave an email or leave a phone message outside of business hours so that the staff member can follow up when they're next in office, but the staff are instructed not to be checking for emails or phone messages outside of business hours. Staff don't give out their personal cell phones, but they use a work number and Google Voice or Text Now to redirect during non-business hours. Second prong, relationships and resources that can support your program in the broader community with crisis response. You're going to want to build the infrastructure to ensure that you have the information on crisis resources in your community and that that's readily available to mentors and mentees, particularly outside of business hours when you can't respond immediately. Your mentoring program can work proactively to develop these relationships, to identify who the partners are, and you can also facilitate a warm introduction by building relationships with the staff and understanding programs that you may need to refer youth to. For example, your program could make an introduction to a case manager at the nearest shelter by having a relationship with that manager. So you're going to want to have your crisis resources in the community and also national resources like hotlines and websites, and provide these resources at the start of the mentorship and have them available in several convenient locations like your email signature, or you could have them on a website or as an auto response during non-business hours. And the third prong is the training of your staff and your mentors. Let's begin with training of mentors. You want to equip your mentors during basic training and provide continuing education with deeper skills for assessing and responding to crises. You're going to provide them the clear program policies for what they should do in the event of different types of crises. You're going to want to offer emotional support and resources during those monthly match support calls that your staff are having. Important thing for us to remember is that during a crisis, the goal is not comfort. The goal is for the mentor to have confidence. So to instill confidence in mentors that they can respond appropriately during a crisis. That's why you're training them. And that's why they are the trusted adult in the life of the young person. And that program staff are available to debrief at the next opportunity during business hours. You're going to want to train your staff. A key part of crisis management will be growing the confidence in the fidelity to the policies and systems that you've already thought carefully about and put in place, and staff supporting one another in adhering to those policies. That's how you're going to grow mentors' confidence in utilizing the information that you've given them and the protocols that you've already thought about, as well as their own good judgment that you have screened for when you approved them. Now, a note for programs that are implementing specific policies or resources after a period of already handling crises on an ad hoc basis. So if your program has already been operating and you've been managing different crises piecemeal, it's probably important for you to reset, to communicate to all mentors and mentees at the same time any changes that you're making. Try and explain the rationale and offer an opportunity for mentors and mentees to share with the program staff anything that's making them nervous about the new policies, and generally offering a time to process their thoughts and questions or feelings about this. So it's a chance for a reset and to adopt a new way forward. So when we're navigating a crisis plan after matching, we're going to focus on harm reduction and a triage plan, especially for young adults. The Silver Lining Mentoring works exclusively with youth impacted by foster care, and as a TA provider, we provide expertise in this area. And many youth in foster care are aging out as young adults and entering the world independently. And so that's why having a triage plan for how to respond to a young person who is actually their own guardian is important, because they are no longer a minor under the supervision of a caregiver. So for mentoring organizations serving young adults, but many of these are also applicable to adolescents and other youth, the reality is that there are only so many options for dealing with some crises, and they may be far from optimal. So mentoring organizations can take a harm reduction approach that's simply aimed at reducing the negative consequences of certain behaviors or circumstances. Mentoring organizations and mentors can help young people with decision-making skills to assess the relative harm about their different paths forward. And as I said, all of which may be far from optimal. Generally, it is less effective in building the skills of your mentees and promoting autonomous decision-making for your program or a mentor to simply tell the young person what to do and make the decision for them. That's really not being as youth-focused as we might want to be. So the following also applies to adults who are their own guardians. So in other words, young adults who are over the age of 18 or have transitioned into adulthood. When program staff are called upon to assist with a crisis response, a triage plan can be put in place based upon the level of imminence of the crisis. So for example, the organization will need to work to ensure that all staff are able to assess crises similarly and uphold the policy in the same way, so that mentors and mentees can rely on a consistent response. How do we create a triage plan? You want to think about the types of crises your program may experience and set up a system that outlines the organization's role depending on the type of situation. It's probably going to have two prongs. One is acute and imminent crises. These would include things like suicidal ideation, active and imminent abuse or violence. If a program staff member receives these crises during business hours, they can call 911 or a mental health crisis team or an immediate response on behalf of the mentor and mentee. The second example would be crises where there is some imminent need, but where the young person's life is not in immediate danger. These might include things like homelessness or a shortage of food. If a program staff member receives these crises during business hours, the program could commit to a same-day response to assess or make a referral. And the triage system should include guidance on how much time staff will spend attending to the crisis, because most coordinators or most staff members at your organization are going to be serving multiple matches that may be experiencing crisis at the same time. For example, 30 to 60 minutes to provide emotional support, listen, offer some resources, and make a plan could be an example of a good time frame or policy for your program. Next, we want to remember a few important things, including attending to the well-being of all involved during and after a crisis. So let's begin with managing the well-being of the staff members in your mentoring program that are often handling these crises potentially every single day, multiple times on end. Programs should make it an institutional priority for staff to uphold the crisis management policies and foster a workplace culture that reinforces and praises compliance. For example, you want to have a culture where employees are saying to one another, it was smart that you redirected someone, or you didn't take that call after hours, and you upheld the policy, even if it was difficult. You want to reinforce that clear policies are for the good of all the young people served by the organization and the good of the community and the mission that you're trying to create. And you're going to support each other in knowing that it's hard, but it's the right thing to adhere so that your organization can be sustainable and that your staff can have a sustainable position. Programs can also encourage staff and mentors to adopt practices of self-care and compassion. A few examples of things that we've seen over the years: some staff may keep a quote on their desk or on their phone that they come back to when they feel like they're letting someone down. Some staff use affirmations like, I did what was equitable, or I did what was fair for this youth and for the rest of my caseload. Some staff end the day with journaling. What was in my control? What was my role? Did I fulfill that role? For example, did I support the mentoring relationship and make it sustainable? If yes, then I did everything I could do today. Support from fellow staff around these self-care practices can also be helpful. It encourages an organizational culture where staff can run decisions by their colleagues for affirmation and support day to day. And staff can support each other in recognizing that they're part of a bigger system that one person can't change on their own. Most of the crises that young people are experiencing are part of much broader societal or community challenges that no staff member should have on their shoulders. For mentees, as we previously said, we want to make sure that we are not undervaluing the role of the mentor and the program staff in providing emotional support and simply being present and walking alongside the young person during a time of crisis. Mentors and program staff also play an important role in building life skills following the crisis, helping to leverage the experience for learning at the appropriate time, which is probably a little bit after the crisis has subsided in its most critical state. For example, analyzing what happened, what could go differently next time, and brainstorming together how to avoid the experience in the future where possible. Depending on the strength and length of the mentoring relationship, a mentor or program staff may be able to observe or discuss with the youth any patterns that they're seeing in the young person's life and check in on these skills that the young person could develop to create different circumstances in the future. For example, asking the youth, did you use any of the skills we talked about last time? Or observing that, I noticed you used that skill, and that seems to have created a different situation. And also, as an organization, as a mentoring program, we want to consider organizational liability. So considering the repercussions of our policy decisions to the organization, whether your mentoring program is an independent 501c3, a nonprofit, or a program within a broader nonprofit or agency, there is still a consideration of the organizational liability. And it depends who you may need to check with to figure that out. You may also want to explore any personal liability that may be at hand if you are operating a program that is not a designated nonprofit, or if you're doing so just as a group of individuals or volunteers. In this area, there's a number of resources you can take advantage of. Recognizing that many mentoring programs have limited financial resources, there certainly is a role for pro bono support from your board members or community experts. And examples of professionals that can provide pro bono counsel to address liability matters include legal counsel, insurance consultations, as well as clinical professionals who can provide guidance and counsel. And lastly, at the end of this webinar, we will be following up with, as we said, the slides and a recording, and we also be sharing a tool, a reflection tool that your program can use. And we have outlined numerous examples of crises that may occur. And it's going to look overwhelming at first, but it is intended to jog your thinking about the different types of crises your program may have already experienced or may not have yet, so that you can do that proactive thinking, reflection, and planning. So it will give you the prompts to look at your program policies and see what may be missing, what haven't you thought about that you want to be prepared for. And you can use the framework that we have talked about here to build out those policies and communicate them and train your mentors and staff. So with that, I will pass it on to my colleagues and we're going to get into some examples.
Awesome. So I saw that Carrie Ann and Amanda had raised your hands, and I'm not sure if you had your questions answered, but wanted to acknowledge that we will have some time for Q&A at the end. And also some of your questions may get answered as Sally goes through some of these examples. But we do ask, if you do have questions, please feel free to put them into the chat, and we'll be monitoring the chat along the way. All right, and I'll pass it to my colleague, Sally.
Thanks, Mobile, and hello again, everyone. So if we could queue up the poll question that we had added. So we're gonna hopefully get that going. So the poll question that we have for you before we get started is, when thinking about a crisis response approach for a situation and thinking about your organization or team, do you have an existing crisis response plan, have plans to, or are thinking about creating one, or you had not thought about it prior to our conversation today? So please take a moment to fill that out. All right, let's see. All right, so it seems like everybody, we got a broad response, but it looks like the majority of folks are thinking about creating one or have plans to. So I'm really excited to get into the example today and hope that it can jog some ideas for you all. So to start off, we're going to be reviewing 2 examples of situations that have come up in our work at Silver Lining, and I'll share how Silver Lining responded and some things for you to consider when creating your own response plan or evaluating an existing one. So I also just want to preface with thinking about how to respond to this crisis. We're going to use the framework that Christina just shared, but it's important to note that I'm going to be sharing about how Silver Lining would respond to this situation. But of course, this is going to vary from community to community and from organization to organization. So I will read the scenario for us and then go into some response consideration. So in this scenario, we have a 20-year-old youth who was involved in a physical altercation with another youth at their group residence. Emergency services and police are called, and the youth is hospitalized for 72 hours. Upon discharge, the youth is not allowed to return to the residence. And at that time, there's no legal concerns for the youth. They're not being charged with anything or anything like that. And the youth reached out to program staff after leaving the hospital looking for support. So lots to think about. We can move on to the next slide. So lots to consider. So first, you want to think about your mission. So are you a crisis organization or a mentoring organization? For us, we're a mentoring organization and our focus is on the mentoring relationship. So Silver Lining's goal would be to connect the mentor and the mentee with the most appropriate resources for whatever's going on. Another piece to consider about this, the young person was put on a 72-hour hold at the hospital because they were in danger of causing harm to themselves and or somewhere else. But the 72-day hold can also take place when there are concerns around suicidal ideation, which we didn't get information that that was going on, but we know it was for the piece around harm to the self or others. And this also happened in lieu of arrest, so as a diversion from incarceration. So yes, up first mission, if your organization is focused on crisis management, or perhaps you have a crisis or case management branch of your work, then you would lean on those resources and identify what the young person may need. Like, is it connection to a therapeutic provider or a psychiatric service? In this case, the youth was actually also involved with the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health. So we did work with the Department of Mental Health to connect around that for this young person. And then moving on to the crisis plan, the three-pronged approach that we learned about earlier, considering policies, infrastructure, and training. So this young person did reach out during business hours, and because Silver Lining has really clear program policies and expectations around when staff are available and what kinds of support is available, they did not expect a response had it happened outside of business hours, but because it happened during business hours, we were able to work with them and make sure that they had access to a list of our resources. So for example, staff, when they are out of office, have in the out of office email, like a list of resources that can be accessed, as well as a resource guide that we share at various points throughout the match. So it's in our out of office, we share it at the beginning of matches during the matchmaking process. And so that provided some safety and security for the young person, kind of knowing they could reach out to us during the day and expect to hear back within a day or so. We were also able to identify with the young person what else might be helpful in that moment. So, you know, they're not able to go back to their residence. They're now removed from their access to food, the community that they had there, and housing. So in this case, we considered what resources are most helpful for them, which was the Department of Mental Health case manager who was going to work on housing with them, and they were able to like stay at a hotel until the next step was figured out. And then Silver Lining was able to provide them some emergency financial assistance for food and like to pay their phone bill, things like that. So knowing very clearly like what are the policies that you have and resources that you have, and making sure that your young people and your mentors know what those are too, can really help in times of crisis, because then you're not scrambling trying to figure out what to do first. And in this case, similarly, the support to the mentor was primarily emotional and like brainstorming how they could be there for the young person, because the mentor knew what they could expect. They could expect to talk to a staff person during business hours about how to support the young person. Again, this is something that we share from the start of the match, you know, program schedules and resources, and discussion around confidentiality and how to respond in an emergency are outlined from the start. So the focus could remain on supporting the mentor and the mentee with all of the emotional components that come up in this kind of stressful situation. And then thinking about the harm reduction and triage piece. So this young person is their own guardian, they're over 18. And had it been a situation with a more acute crisis, such as what happened at the group residence, perhaps emergency mental health personnel would have been called, or 911, just like they did at the group home. But because by the time we learned about it, it was more about resource brokering and managing like where they're gonna stay, we could focus on connecting them with those community resources and planning for the future. So supporting the mentor as well is just additional guidance on how to support the mentee and what resources they can access. So most important was just having this clearly outlined plan for how staff can respond to the situation, how the mentor can respond to the situation, including the limits of that support that you can provide, and a timeline for how long staff are going to work on responding, and what mentors and mentees can and can't expect. So we can move on to the next. And then after this happened, so attending to the well-being of everybody involved, the mentee was able and willing to connect with staff. So we were able to check in with them and create a plan about what was the most important thing first. So obviously housing, which we were able to work out with DMH, and helping them out with their phone bills, getting access to money for food, and working with them to identify possible employment opportunities so they could continue to meet those needs in the future. For the mentor, the work was around validating their response to want to be there for the young person, offering debrief and processing time around what's happening, and clarifying their role. Like, it's not their job to find the mentee a place to live, but it is their role to show up and be there consistently. And staff, checking in with staff. So staff have at Silver Lining access to a lot of support through individual and peer supervision. So you have plenty of spaces to process around what has happened and the best way to be there in a staff role. And similarly, we do have a culture of support that's structured to encourage people to uphold policies in service of young people. Yeah, and encouraging folks to care for themselves. And a last piece about organizational liability, like Christina mentioned, when you're thinking about this piece for your organization, the best that you can do is to work with the lawyer and figure out the best way to protect your community that way. So we can move on to the next example. So it's a little bit different. In this scenario, we have a 16-year-old young person who ran away from their group home. The youth was refusing to talk with their legal guardian, Department of Children and Families provider, DCS, but they did reach out to the mentor asking if they could stay with her. The youth was declining to share any information about where she was, and she did not want to be found. She did not want to be returned to care. So in this case, the mentor reached out to program staff with this update and hoping to get some support. So similarly, our focus is on the mentoring relationship. So we're going to look for where are the partnerships and the connections and the resources we can lean on. As I mentioned, the young person was declining to engage with DCF, but our work with DCF involved just keeping them updated. So thinking about the three-prong approach to the crisis plan, in this case, the young person is under 18 and was under DCF custody. So the way Silver Lining responded was to refer to the DCF policies that were already in place for young people who are identified as a runaway, and determine who's responsible for what when this is going on. So for example, the young person ran away from the group home, and so DCF was responsible for reporting that, like the group home was responsible for reporting that to DCF. DCF also had dedicated staff who work with the young person who's identified as missing. And so they were the ones who were responsible for taking on the work of looking for the young person. Also outlined in their policy was what they expected from Silver Lining and the mentor in this case. So basically program staff at Silver Lining worked with DCF and with the mentor to come up with a plan. So what are you supposed to report to Silver Lining? When are you supposed to report it? And what is and is not allowed? So again, leaning back on really clear policies, mentees are not allowed into mentors' homes prior to a certain point, and they wouldn't be allowed to stay with them in this case. So because this is outlined at the very beginning of the relationship during the match meeting, it was obviously emotionally challenging for the mentor to have to tell this young person that they can't stay with them, but they know like it's better and it's supportive of their safety in this case. So yeah, so our policy in this case was just to rely on another policy because we're not a crisis organization and that's not our role. So if you were a crisis organization, perhaps you would want to ensure you have clear policies on who does what and when. And then thinking about the harm reduction and triage plan. So DCF guardianship really limited the ways that the mentor and Silver Lining could be involved. Like I mentioned, we weren't going to go out like searching for the young person and we had no idea where to even begin. But there was just a very clear plan for the mentor. And in this case, the mentor struggled a lot with how to navigate like being available for the young person and like having outside responsibilities. So working with the mentor to ensure that they uphold their boundaries and make it clear to the mentee what they would have to share. So in this case, the piece around confidentiality that we talk about at the beginning of matches, which just states that everything that goes on between the mentor and the mentee, everything that they discuss is private with the exception of when there's a risk for harm. So we had to work with the mentor to remind the young person that if and when they mention something that is concerning, they would have to let us and DCF know. So also a lot of work around trying to preserve that relationship, because those kinds of conversations can be really challenging and pose a threat to the relationship. But yeah, that's how we manage. We can move on to the next slide. And then in this case, attending to the well-being of everybody going forward. So the mentee did not want to be reached by us. She only communicated with the mentor a tiny bit, and strictly through email. She would not get on the phone or anything like that. And so there was a lot of work with program staff and the mentor. The mentor would report back anytime she received an update from the mentee. But the mentee made it pretty clear that she did not want to be found. So of course that presents a challenge, trying to figure out how to support a person who doesn't want to engage, but we would just share through the mentor what silver lining could provide. And then the mentor really needed clear, regular check-ins and a debrief space and a lot of validation. She had a challenging time navigating, like, not letting the crisis that the young person was going through consume her thoughts all the time. So that's where Silver Lining staff came in to help her work on that and knowing where she's limited in providing support and what she could do. And again, organizational liability in this case, a lot of it really went back to the Department of Children and Families, as they were the guardians for the young person, and they were the ones who were managing her as a missing person. And our role was just to report back to them whenever we learned something different. So we can, yeah. So essentially, those are our two examples, and I know that probably a lot of questions have popped up. So I know we wanted to share some time for questions. So please feel free to share. I think, are they coming through the Q&A space? Okay, perfect. Oh,
Yeah, so Q&A is coming up after, so Bianca will wrap us
okay, we're
up,
doing
but
them all
we did
together.
want to share on the screen right now, you can see ways for you to stay in touch with our team, which are via no-cost consulting if you're interested in a deeper connection with our organization. And you can also like us and follow us on social media. Even though you already like us in real life, you can do it in the virtual world as well. And you also on the screen will see our website and contact for myself and Christina if you do want to get in touch after this webinar. But I will pass it over to my colleague Bianca to do some closeout slides, and then we'll have time for Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much. That was awesome. I see lots of people have questions and they're asking, are we going to get copies of this training? So we'll get to those questions in a second. You can go ahead and cue to the next slide. As we close out, I just want to remind you of some ways that you can actually just connect with the Mentor National and also the affiliates, which are like a clearinghouse for training, resources, awareness, and advocacy. So find your local affiliate. Also, you can recruit mentors by submitting your program to the Mentoring Connector. And then, of course, please check out the evidence-based resources from OJJDP, the National Mentoring Resource Center, and that is where you can actually apply for no-cost training and technical assistance. And so after the webinar, you are going to receive a survey at the end, and we really would like for you to fill out that survey. Yes, you will get a copy of the slides, the recording, and all of these resources will be on the Collaborative Mentoring Webinar Series webpage and on the Mentor website. And then, of course, you can email us at collaborative webinar series at mentoring.org. Feel free to tweet with the hashtag mentoring webinar and visit our page on the Mentor website for the past and upcoming webinars. All right, so let's get to some of these questions. All right, let's see. Got quite a few. Any recommendations when communicating with when any recommendations when communicating with parents is not an option. So for example, the child runs away from home due to safety concerns with the parent. However, the youth is cooperating with the agency and the mentor. Is the organization obligated to notify the parent of any known whereabouts of the child, assuming that CPS and the police have already been notified?
That's a great question. Just to make sure that I think I understand, but so in this situation, the young person runs away from home and they live at home with their parent. The young person is cooperating with the agency and their mentor, and it looks like Child Protective Services and police already know. So if all of that is true, I think the best way to go about this would be having it already written into your plans of what to do in this situation. But I would imagine that this would be a scenario where you could break that confidentiality because the young person, well, it depends on their age, they say. If the young person is a minor, which, yeah, they would be under protective custody, right? So assuming that they are under protective custody, I would say that that is a situation that qualifies breaking confidentiality as it's written. I think it may be slightly different depending state by state, like slightly, so double check where you live, but I think, yes, that you would be able to tell the parent unless they are not allowed to talk with the parent. So that has happened too, where the young person has been removed from the home and like the parent's not technically supposed to have contact with them. That changes it, but I would say, yes, you could tell them. Christina and Mobile, I don't know if you have any other examples that come up in your mind, but I would say.
But are you obligated to notify the parent? I think that was the question of any known whereabouts of the child. I guess the parent communicating with that parent is not an option. Maybe they're not involved or something.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that they would not be then, as long as the guardian knows, which I would assume is CPS, so they would already know. So I think that they wouldn't need to tell them.
Yeah, I similarly see this without the details. It sounds like the Child Protective Agency would be in the driver's seat, right? So that would be, if we are talking about a minor aged child, which I'm assuming, based on your example, and Child Protective Services gets involved with minor aged children, not adults that are 25, et cetera, then the Child Protective Services would be managing the situation. And so I would probably go to them and determine, some guidance from them. Because as Sally said, we don't know what's going on with the parent. So whenever we have the situation where we don't know, you kind of want to err on the side of figuring out who has authority here, right? The police, the Child Protective Services, and consult with them to understand the whole situation. So I would say, as long as you've contacted the appropriate authorities for a missing minor aged child, then I think that's the primary obligation you have. And then after that, you're consulting with them for further steps, if any.
Okay, another question I see, do you ever have any confidentiality issues working with kids that are in DFPS, so Department of Family and Protective Services or Child Protective Services custody?
Confidentiality issues, meaning when you have to break it, not knowing what to do. There are definitely confidentiality issues, but the Department of Children and Families has pretty clear guidelines on when to break confidentiality. It usually comes back to an issue of safety. So if the young person is at risk for harm, whether that's physical or like suicidal ideation, anything like that, then like it definitely comes up, but you would just know when you needed to break it. And sometimes you just have to do that. That's just your obligation as a mandated reporter. I don't know if that answers the question. Yeah.
I'll also hop in. I asked for a little more clarity from Chad.
Oh,
The question
okay.
of, do we have an MOU or protocol to work with young people in custody? So at Silver Lining Mentoring, part of our work is that we contract with our Department of Children, Youth and Families here locally to have mentors or mentees referred to our program. So we do have a working relationship with the department or the child welfare system that's local to our organization. And so there are like certain pieces of that requirement or that relationship that has specific requirements around reporting to them and letting them know how the relationships are going with the mentors and mentees. We do, I think, a monthly report to the department for any of the matches that we're managing that they refer to our team and who they are directly supporting through that kind of MOU relationship that we have in place. So there is that consideration that we have that relationship in place. Awesome. Great. And then I think there's one more question around LGBTQ. Let me just scroll back up. What about LGBTQ youth that run away from a bad home life or gets kicked out? I'm wondering if there's more that you can elaborate on. It's the question of if we are required to like report them as runaways to their family, if that might not be safe based on the fact that they ran away for their own safety. Hoping to understand your question a bit more and also kick it to my colleagues if you have any more immediate responses before we have more clarity.
Yeah, well, one thing that immediately jumps out to us is another aspect of mentor screening and training, which is we do want to serve all youth, both the identities that they come into our program with and any that they may develop as they grow up. And so we do screen and train and expect all mentors to be able to be supportive adults to young people of all identities, including LGBTQ and gender expressions. So to just begin with, we would expect that this young person's mentor would be a source of support for them, regardless of what they may be experiencing. And we certainly hope that they would have had a chance to talk with their mentor about anything that they're experiencing, either in the home or in any other part of life that is concerning for them. I think often with these questions, it really comes back to our society. All of our states, for the most part, have different laws, whether we're talking about a minor aged child under the age of 18, or we're talking about a legal adult, right? And so I gather, so I think from your question, if we're talking about a youth that is a minor aged child that doesn't have a place to live or is known to be potentially at risk of harm, that's handled much the same way any situation of harm would be handled, where we are required to have minor age children in the care of someone. So that could be a situation where the program would have to get involved because this would essentially be a homeless youth, right? And so that's something we have to deal with.
Thank you. I see there's a question here. For a minor, is it enough to notify the school if you are concerned about harm, or is it required to contact DCS or police? If the mentor is an obligatory reporter, do they report to DCS or police, or can you just report to the school? So like if the mentor is also like in a position where they are like a teacher or a physician, where they are also a reporter, do they report it to DCS or police, or can they just report it to the school?
That's such a great question. I think my initial response is that you definitely want to, if you're a mandated reporter or an obligatory reporter, that you uphold that end of your responsibility as a professional. So you would need to report that to the reporting agency that you're required to mandate those reports to, generally speaking. As an organization, we in our mentor training talk with mentors about the fact that we are training them in the protocol around confidentiality that Sally has already spoken of, but that if they're reporting a concern, if it's one of those concerns that are like immediate potential harm and like it's very clear you need to report this to an agency, we'll ask them to report that to the agency, and we do provide the number for reporting to the DCF hotline. But then we also ask them to let us know that they are making the report, or to be able to have support in making that report, so that we as an organization can be prepared to offer that mentor support that will be necessary, knowing that if the mentor is going to have to do this obligatory thing, that it could have implications on the relationship. And so our role as an organization is to be ready to support those implications on the relationship and being able to support the mentor in navigating that. So yeah, I'll pause there and see if my colleagues have anything else to offer.
Yeah, I mean, I think just as you're launching your mentoring program, being crystal clear on who is a mandated reporter, who on your staff, if anyone, and if you're not mandated reporters, what is your reporting protocol, when does it occur? And then we always say to mentors, and we have a number of mentors who are mandated reporters because they're nurses, doctors, and teachers. Then that trumps everything. Then that's what you are, right? Just because you're a mentor, that doesn't remove those other responsibilities that you have. And if you are a mandated reporter, at least in Massachusetts, and I imagine in other states, you have to go through a required training so you know what your obligations are. So follow that training.
Thank you for that. Let's see, do we have any more questions? All right, well, I don't see anything in the Q&A. I don't see anything in the chat. Let's see. Thank you so much then for joining us. Please join us next month. Our next webinar is October 6th. This is a rescheduled webinar. It was scheduled for August. So next month's webinar will be expanding mentorships to center around Gen Z agency advocacy and decision making. So really digging into those Gen Z relationships. And then there will be another webinar on our regular third Thursday of the month, which I think is like October 20th. So just wanted to ping that because I know our schedule is a little bit off, but this one is a rescheduled webinar. So please join us. And thank you everyone for being in community with us. Please fill out the survey. We just dropped it in the chat. And until next time, family, we will see you. I guess October 6th is a couple of weeks away.